The States is a little different because it never was a homogeneous country, right? There was always people of different ethnicities in the country. But there's a very clear racial hierarchy. Sure, you had Native Americans. Sure, you had African Americans, but they were very badly treated. And though you had people from more different nations and religions coming in, they actually still had a lot of commonality. By and large, they were European and Christian, right? Some Jews. And now, for the first time, the country has to actually grapple with making a multi-ethnic society, which it has always been, but an equal multi-ethnic society where we're overcoming the racial hierarchy. And by the way, we've made some real progress in that compared to 50 years ago. And there's something that's often forgotten, I think, in discussions today. Compared to 50 years ago, the United States is a much, much, much more equal society among racial lines. But it's obviously still far from being truly equal. And similarly to Europe, there are some people who embrace that equality and aspire to it and want to push it further, and some people who are really threatened by it. And that is, both of those are sort of unique experiments. We don't have many examples in human history of equal multi-ethnic democracies. So we're struggling to create one.
So this speaks to a debate that has been very heated and long-running over the past 2 years, I would say 3 years maybe in America, which is the rise of right-wing populism, which I think we, again, typically talk about this in America about Donald Trump, but it's the Le Pens in France, It is Brexit in England. I mean, you see this in a lot of different countries. Is it a function of economics and economic stagnation?
Right.
So as soon as the economies are growing well again, it'll just sort of like poof, go away. Or if we had a better social safety net, it would poof, go away. Or is it a reaction to these very sharply changing, very fast changing demographics? I mean, something I think people don't always realize is that in America and then also in Europe, the demographic change, the racial and ethnic demographic change in the past 50 years,
very rapid,
30 years has been very, very rapid, particularly in Europe because of the opening of the EU. A lot of the evidence I've seen has tilted me more towards this is about changing demographics. It was not all that heavily correlated to growth rates in the last couple of years. But I also recognize the interplay is complicated. I'm curious where you come down on that, where the evidence feels strongest to you.
So let's take them one by one. So I think that there's a lot of really simplistic thought going on in this space. The first simplistic thought is that it has to be one or the other, right? And that's just like, generally speaking, the social world is not monocausal. When really interesting big phenomena are going on, it's rarely one thing that makes it happen.
I know, it's a bummer.
Often an interplay, right? Well, no, it's not a bummer because it means that,
it is
that
if you
all
have to
these
write
things
about it. I'm just kidding.
I guess,
I'm kidding.
I see what you're saying.
It's a dumb joke.
So first of all, it's not clear to me that we have to remake it one or the other. But even when you look at each of them, it's a little more complicated than people want to say, right? So I've seen a lot of analyses which are, does your income level predict very well whether or not you support Donald Trump? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It's true. It doesn't. So it's nothing to do with the economy. I think that's such a simplistic thing to jump to. It seems to me that when you look into the granular details, it becomes much more predictive. So it's not about how wealthy are you. Because the very poorest often aren't that tempted by forms of populism or even forms of fascism historically, because they have direct benefits that they get from the state and they sort of need it in a bigger way. And precisely because it's often around resentment. It's a feeling of decline. Now, people at the very bottom of society who've always been at the bottom don't have a feeling of decline. They've always been at the bottom. But people who have a feeling of decline are sort of the lower middle classes, the middle classes who feel that they're slipping. Those are probably the people in the book that we're talking about, right? So that's the first reason. Also, historically, like the people who vote for Republican are much wealthier, right? So actually, that's shifted down in the Trump election. That's significant. But what's really going on, I think, is, and I know people sort of ballyhoo this phrase, is economic anxiety. When you look at the communities who voted for Trump, it is people where locally there's very little economic growth, who perhaps are still doing fine, but who have neighbors who are underwater on the mortgage, who have the next community over that's not doing very well, who are in sectors of the economy where they actually have good reason to think that they're going to suffer from automation and so on, who are in more rural areas, which aren't profiting from globalization and technology in the way that New York City or Washington, D.C. and the Bay Area are. So once you start looking at slightly more detailed things there, it becomes more of a story. And similarly for the sort of identity and demographic transformation sort of thing, right? Look, there's a really simple argument against this that people weirdly don't make, but that is simplistic in exactly the same way, which is, well, If it's driven by demographic transformation, why isn't New York City voting for Trump in massive numbers? Why isn't California voting for Trump in massive numbers? It's not true that the parts of a country that vote for Trump are the parts of a country that are most diverse, right? Well, we have an understanding that it's a little bit more complicated than that. 3/4 of American counties were more than 90% white 20 years ago and are now less than 90% white. I think that moment of a demographic transition is often when you get the most anger. So as you go from being a pretty diverse place and you have to deal with people who are not like you all of the time anyway, to being in a place that's really diverse and you have to deal with people who are not like you, more often, it doesn't matter so much to people. But when you go from a place where everybody's like you, basically, and you really don't have to deal with people who don't speak perfect English, who have different beliefs from you, and when suddenly this is a part of your daily life, that's when people often get really, really scared. And that's true in a lot of the country, and it's true in a lot of the places that voted for Donald Trump. Now, how do these things fit together? How do they interrelate? And that, I think, is a really important thing. I've thought a lot about the image of somebody who is proud of their job and that gives them an identity. You ask somebody 30 years ago who was a coal miner, somebody who works in a factory, somebody who's in a union, who are you? So the question, who are you? I think a lot of them would have said, I'm a coal miner. I'm a member of the Teamsters. I'm a foreman in a factory. And as they lose those jobs, and perhaps they're still doing materially okay, perhaps they're now a shift manager at Walmart, but they've now transitioned into jobs that don't give them the same identity, that don't give them the sense of collective belonging, that don't give them the same pride. And you ask them, who are you? They say, well, you know what? I'm white. I'm not being treated well in this country anymore, and I'm resentful that those people over there are now doing better than me, right? So a lot of the racial resentment, a lot of the resentment at the demographic transition, I think, is itself driven by those underlying, more complicated economic fears. It's one thing to say, look, I'm twice as rich as my parents were, my kids are going to be twice as rich as me, and oh, look, that immigrant over there, he's doing really well too. Good for him. Versus, I feel like I've worked really hard all my life and I haven't gotten ahead. I don't have a better life than my parents. And I think my kids are going to be screwed. And why on earth is that immigrant over there doing okay? Right? It just changes the context in which we have this conversation.